I am Valentin Fuster from New York, attending the scientific sessions of the American Heart Association in Philadelphia. And as usually, we like to give a summary of the most important papers that have been presented, particularly trials. And I have here a group of experts that I really appreciate their presence today to discuss all the different subjects, which are many, by the way. I'd like to introduce first on my right Dr. Bonnie Key, who is director of the Penn Cardio-Oncology Center of Excellence at the Perelman School of Medicine here in Philadelphia. And she's actually the new editor of a new journal, JACC Cardio-Oncology. Here on my left, Dr. Christy Ballantyne, that I'm sure you recognize, Chief of Cardiology and Cardiovascular Research at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston. And then on the right, another Philadelphia person, Dr. David Collins, Associate Director of Electrophysiology at the University of Pennsylvania Health System. And we took advantage of Philadelphia, so let's go now to the left. Dr. Joe Bavaria, Director of Thoracic Aortic Surgery and Program here at the University of Pennsylvania Health System. Well, I really appreciate you being here today. It's not easy. Many papers have been presented and a lot of statistical things that I will not try to go into the details, but I will say just for the audience what we are going to be talking about. There are 4 papers on coronary artery disease. One is in evaluation, ischemia, 2 on acute coronary syndromes, the twilight acute coronary syndromes and the issue of ticagrelor aspirin versus ticagrelor alone. COLCOT, a very interesting study of colchicine in acute myocardial infarction. And then COMPASS, just to look at patients with chronic coronary artery disease, again the issue of rivaroxaban plus aspirin. Here is about in patients with stenting and without stenting. So 4 papers. Then we have aortic stenosis. Are we operating too late? The recovery paper, asymptomatic patients with severe aortic stenosis. The next one is a very interesting one, is the French TAVI registry about balloon approach versus the self-enhancement of the aortic valve with different types of materials, and we will be discussing. Very interesting registry and with surprises. The final one in the aortic side is the Galileo study, which is antithrombotic therapy with rivaroxaban after TAVR. Then we have 2 papers on heart failure. One is the DAPA-HF study about results in terms of outcomes and also about quality of life. And then we have the Paragon-HF study on sacubitril and valsartan in patients with different ranges of ejection fraction. If we don't have enough, we have to really touch prevention. Otherwise, I don't think we are doing a right job here. There are 2 studies, the Orion study with a very interesting new drug, inclisiran, and then the Familia study, which is a new approach to prevention carried out in an underserved population in Harlem. So let's start with coronary artery disease. We have 4 papers. Let's be sure we don't get focused on ischemia and ischemia and ischemia. It's just be simple. Let's discuss the paper of ischemia, and then we'll go some discussion, and we will move on into all the other papers. We just have 1 hour. So ischemia. This is a very important study presented here in the meeting, and is the clinical or primary report of clinical outcomes. Dr. Judith Hochman from the NYU School of Medicine made the presentation. And I just like to make an introduction. If you recall in the COURAGE trial, medical therapy and stenting, actually they had similar results. But there was one group of patients that was always questionable, those patients with at least moderate ischemia. We wanted the answer. I think we have the answer today in the ischemia trial. Let me describe it for you. These are patients with a stable coronary artery disease and moderate to severe ischemia. They were scrutinizing 8,500 patients. Finally, 5,000 were randomized. all these patients that were randomized in actually 320 sites in 37 centers were randomized, but before they did CT angiography. And after the angiography, it was decided by randomization if the patients were going to follow a conservative approach with optimal medical therapy versus an invasive strategy that might lead to intervention. This was a 4 years of follow-up. Primary endpoints, time to cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, hospitalization for unstable angina, heart failure, or resuscitated cardiac arrest. Important is how the patients actually were included in the study, how moderate or severe ischemia was diagnosed. This is important. Nuclear technology, more than 10% of the left ventricle in ischemia under stress. If we use echo stress, 3 segments or more than 3 segments showing severe hypokinesis or akinesis. CMR is a combination of both, perfusion, equal or more than 12% left ventricular ischemia, and wall motion, again, 3 or more than 3 of the 16 segments showing what we already mentioned with echocardiography, severe hypokinesis or akinesis. What about patients who had exercise testing just with electrocardiography? 1.5 millimeter ST depression in 2 leads or more than 2 millimeter ST depression in 1 lead. So this is how moderate to severe ischemia was identified. Exclusion criteria is important. New York Heart Association classification, class 3 or class 4. Patients with ejection fraction less than 35%, acute coronary syndrome within 2 months, and certainly excluding left main coronary artery disease. Now, of interest, of the patients who had the approach of cardiac catheterization, this was carried out in most of them, 96%. But what about the group with optimal medical therapy? There was a crossover in 28% of the patients that ended up with cardiac catheterization. Now, the type of revascularization, when it was done, PCI 75% of the patients, CABG 25% of them. Results. Obviously, we were all anxious about the results. No difference on anything. I would say that in the first 2 years, the curves are exactly the same. After 2 years, maybe a trend in favor of the invasive approach, but not significant. So the results are at 4 years, 16% primary outcomes, as we mentioned, in the group actually treated with optimal medical therapy, and the other group was actually 16 or 18%. Excuse me, these curves are so close that I can be wrong in saying, okay? So basically the group that was treated with optimal medical therapy was about 18% event rate, and the other was 16%. The results were not significant, but it's a crossing over about 2 years of follow-up, just a trend. And then we can talk about secondary measure endpoints, cardiovascular death and NMI, no difference. Cardiovascular death, no difference. All-cause death, no difference. Myocardial infarction, no difference. Always with a trend in favor of the invasive approach. And then taking into account there was a crossover in a group of patients too. So we have to take this into account. So I like to actually summarize the data by saying that ischemia is the largest trial of a non-invasive versus conservative strategy in patients with a stable coronary artery disease. The curves cross at about 2 years, and afterwards, if there is a separation, certainly it's not statistically significant, but if anything, the invasive approach is a little bit better than the non-invasive approach. Actually, the overall mortality and events in this study was rather low, so we might think that perhaps medical therapy was carried out much better than in some other studies. So this is basically what I like to present to you today, and I like to ask, to have few questions about the study in itself. Dr. Valentine, this is the medical therapies. What I want to ask is much better than years ago, so maybe it's a part of the deal here.
Yeah, I think as medical therapies have improved, controlling risk factors, antiplatelet therapies, the event rate goes down, and it's going to be harder to show a difference.
The other question I have is, Joe, the number of events was actually lower than in the past. You think we are doing better with all these invasive procedures?
Yeah, I think we're doing better in both of the medical and surgical management and the PCI management. There's no question about it. If you look at the big databases too, the results of PCI as well as the results of surgery are improving over the past decade fairly substantially, actually. And these are all risk adjusted. So I think the study was a huge study. I think the main thing that's going to happen from it is it's not going to be urgent. It's not going to be emergent, or you can take your time working somebody up. You don't have to be all afraid, and both the patients and the physicians. I think that you can put them on decent medical management and take your time and figure things out.
Bonnie, this is a winner for CT angiography, actually, because basically all the patients started with CT angiography to know what was going on. This is going to change, obviously, towards that procedure. Is not correct?
Yeah, exactly. I think a huge win for CT angio in terms of the diagnosis of coronary disease, and just a great, really well done, very detailed study in terms of the workup of the patient. Really a model for us.
You know, I frankly think, David, that when we do intervention in patients with chronic coronary artery disease, I think more about the quality of life than prolonging life in general. Well, we were in the FREEDOM trial, the patient is diabetic and so forth, but if you really look at all these patients who come to us with chronic disease, what we try to do is to treat the angina. Here it works. So there is one of the sub-studies of ischemia in which they look at angina, and actually daily, weekly angina in 21% of the patients. This is at baseline, 44% several times a month, and 34% did not have angina. And then they provided the results, and certainly there's a significant improvement in the symptomatology. So we should not be so negative, isn't it?
I think it's true. And, you know, the way we talk to patients, you know, you had chest pain, oh, that's an emergency, you have to go to the emergency room all the time. It teaches them the wrong thing. You know, and I think this should be looked from a patient standpoint as very reassuring. You know, we kind of got control of this, we can do this.
I was just thinking, Bonnie, what I would do when I get back home with this type of patients that I didn't do before. And the only thing that I see a little bit different is the issue of CT angiography.
That's a great
What
point.
about you? What do you think?
No, I think that's a great point. I think the use of CT angio more and more, I think, is certainly, this study would provide evidence for that. I think another curious thing about this study, or a few curious things, is long-term. What's going to happen long-term? As you indicated, the curve they crossed over, maybe suggestive of a small benefit for, you know, so I think that's interesting. And also, everyone here has talked about patients and involving patients in that decision-making process about what is the next best step for them.
Chris, I want to ask you, are you going to change your practice? Because you still treat patients for angina if they need intervention. Is not correct? Just
Correct. I think there's still a lot of practice where people are getting almost annual stress testing and looking for small ischemic defects, and they still go to cath. And I think that practice, we already knew that wasn't very a good, was not necessary, and this really confirms it, that you don't need to do routine stress testing in patients who have known coronary disease and you see a small defect and you have to cath somebody. And I think you're right. CT angio is a step that's a very reasonable step. If you have a large defect, you can do a CT angio. And you might ask, do you need to do CT angio plus FFR? I don't know. That might be the other one that comes in there with it. But I think it shifts things from going straight to the cath lab.
yeah, I think Joe was right in the sense that we are going to be cooled down, taking the time to make decisions much more than perhaps before, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah, I don't think it's actually going to change things in the end, but it's going to cool it down, make it slower, make it more, make everything a little bit more robust, and actually put everybody at ease a little bit. In the end, I don't know whether it's actually going to make a difference regarding whether someone gets a PCI or someone gets a CABG, but it won't be
Okay.
emergent, that's for sure.
Well, look, thank you very much. It took 10 minutes. It's great because I thought it was going to take 50 minutes. So, okay, we did it. I think we touched into the most important things, and let's now move on into we have 3 more papers on coronary artery disease. I'd like to touch into the Twilight acute coronary syndrome paper, which is the following, the one that was more on the general patients with coronary artery disease. This paper was presented in this meeting by Usman Baber from, actually it's from Mount Sinai, from our group. And basically, you know what happened with the previous study just published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and that is aspirin is having a bad time, I think, somehow, because basically these are high-risk patients. In this case, we are talking about acute coronary syndrome, in which you see at the beginning you may give ticagrelor plus aspirin the first 3 months, but later on, if you give both drugs, there is a problem with bleeding, so why you don't give ticagrelor alone, and maybe we'll do the job compared with ticagrelor and aspirin. And this is actually what was done during the first 3 months, and then for 1 year was aspirin plus ticagrelor versus aspirin alone. I don't think I have to go into great details because we all know the basic study, but it's interesting to go over the results. We are dealing here with acute coronary syndromes, which in the other study was general patients with high-risk coronary artery disease. Well, incidence of significant bleeding was 7.6% in the ticagrelor plus aspirin group versus 3.6% in the ticagrelor alone group. And then you say maybe the incidence of events will be much higher in the ticagrelor alone, and it's not, 4.4%, the other 4.3%. So very basically, what we are seeing is that any patient at high risk for coronary artery disease, when we are going to intervene, the use of this ticagrelor alone instead of ticagrelor plus aspirin, after 3 months of using both, it appears this is the way to go. I would just add a fact, and that is unstable angina or non-STEMI, they did exactly the same. And the results are the same that for the main study. So I think this is going to change practice in a way. So what do you think, Bonnie, about this study, the Twilight study?
I think it's fascinating. I don't, classic teaching in all throughout school and through training and through practice is aspirin in terms of treating acute coronary syndrome and MI. But here, you're absolutely right. Aspirin's been getting a bad rap recently, and it's just changing, I think, what we know about medicine. So,
everything goes in waves, isn't it? I could never believe that aspirin will fall apart. But anyway, so Chris, so what do you think about the study in itself? You think this is a significant...
Yeah, I mean, the issue of dual antiplatelet therapy for a year, this is kind of ingrained, but I think that it's illogical if you have a more effective, you have this acute period, and so clearly ticagrelor is more effective, so you're giving something that has the bleeding risk without adding efficacy. It's not always better to use more, I think, if you can have fewer side effects, and clearly the problem has always been with antiplatelet or other antithrombotic is how do we minimize the bleeding risk? And this seems to be one where you minimize the bleeding risk, but you don't lose any efficacy, and it's easier for patients. Yeah.
David, I have a question. There is a movement now, 2 movements, I would say. One is cost. And the other movement, of course, is the issue of prevention and so forth. Now here we have ticagrelor. Do you know how many people in the world can afford this drug?
Oh, it's a tough one to afford. I don't know the details on the number, but
It's not good.
it's not good.
And the question I have for you is this: what about a trial that you use for the first 3 months ticagrelor and aspirin, and then you just use clopidogrel, for example?
Well, I think it makes sense. I mean, there's an analogy with, my usual world treating people with AF. So the decision about triple therapy and recent PCI in patients who need anticoagulation for their AF, that's simplified to Plavix without aspirin. So I think that would make perfect sense to me.
I think we have to look at the cost of all of this because we are used to talk about all of this with no problem.
Right.
But I can tell you
that's the only issue, really.
it's a huge problem around the world. Yeah.
So it's the only issue. I mean, it's just as you just said, you have the same efficacy and decreased bleeding. It's a no-brainer. But if it was not so expensive, it would be a no-brainer, but it's very expensive. I like your idea, and
I like it too.
yeah.
I think it will
Yeah,
come. They
that
have to do a
would-
randomized study on that,
That's-
I
yeah.
think. Well, anyway, thank you very much. We are not doing too badly, actually. We have done 2 papers. Let's now for this one. I am very surprised about this one, I must say to you. It's the Colchicine paper. It's the Colcott study. Out of the blue, it's almost difficult to believe this, but it's fantastic. Well, this paper is called Colcott, and basically the title was published in the New England Journal of Medicine already, Efficacy and Safety of Low-Dose Colchicine After Myocardial Infarction. This is a paper that is, the leading author is Dr. Jean-Claude Tardif from the Montreal Heart Institute. And actually, it's a fascinating story. Well, we all talk about inflammation in patients with coronary artery disease, the CANTOS study. Methotrexate didn't work. Why? Because the inflammatory pathways are so many that you really have to hit into the right one. Well, colchicine, it seems to me, it did it. We give colchicine, actually a very cheap drug, isn't it, for the treatment of gout?
Right
and
now it is.
yeah.
I wonder what will happen.
Pericarditis, familial Mediterranean fever. I mean, it has been used for many purposes, but anyway, this is the study that I like to present or to introduce. This is an international study, double-blind trial involving patients recruited within 30 days after myocardial infarction. Low-dose colchicine, 0.5 milligrams once a day, or versus placebo. The primary efficacy endpoint was a composite of death from cardiovascular causes, resuscitation, cardiac arrest, myocardial infarction, stroke, urgent hospitalization for angina leading to coronary revascularization. And safety was also assessed. The number of patients that were randomized actually were almost 5,000, and in equal groups, colchicine versus placebo. And now we have the primary endpoint that I mentioned a minute ago. Well, all the variables, the results point out to 5.5 events in the group treated with colchicine, 7.1 in the group treated with placebo. This is a follow-up of 4 years. What is fascinating of the paper, in my view, is that each of the components that I mentioned that were part of the total, there was a statistical significance. Whether you go for cardiac arrest and defibrillation, where you go for myocardial infarction, for a stroke. I mean, it's very fascinating with hazard ratios about 0.8. For a stroke was 0.2. So in a way, the conclusion of this paper, according to the presentation in the New England Journal, is among patients with a recent myocardial infarction, colchicine at a dose of 0.5 milligrams daily led to a significantly lower risk of ischemic cardiovascular events than placebo. This is the story of the paper. Chris, what do you think?
Very exciting, as you said. We had a very expensive therapy that did not get approved by the FDA, canakinumab.
That's right.
Methotrexate failed, but here we see success. And there's another large study in progress with colchicine, and if that one is successful, this will be a game changer. I mean, we have one impressive study, and if we get a second one, we've got a high level of evidence that would be to change practice. So I'm looking forward. I'm not sure when the second one's coming out. I'm looking forward to it.
So Bonnie, just in your purse, put colchicine and take aspirin out.
Yeah.
You know.
I thought it was a great study too. I think what's interesting though, and what I hope to see changing in trials too, is they did exclude patients who had cancer within the past 3 years. And who knows, maybe like canakinumab, there could also be a benefit with cancer. So maybe that too in the next phase, we can learn something about that.
David?
I just wonder about going farther upstream, like have a HOPE study with colchicine instead of vitamin E. Maybe that would be the real way to look at this. It seems too good to be true. No side effects to speak of either. I mean, they were essentially equivalent to placebo, so pretty impressive.
So how the surgical field will react to all these drugs that are coming back?
I don't think we'll react either one way or the other. Colchicine issue is interesting. I'm kind of with you. I believe this would need a second, reaffirmative study. I'm not sure this is going to change practice by itself. The difference was statistically significant, but 5.6 or 5.8 versus 7.1 is not incredible differences in reality. So I'm not I think it will need another secondary study too.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Okay, thank you. We still have another thing coming up. It's interesting, you know, pharmacology is coming back somehow. We thought about 2-3 years ago, it was all intervention, and pharmacology is out there. But it's coming back, and the papers presented here, actually, there are 70% of what they are presenting today is pharmacologically speaking. So here's another one. And we are still in coronary artery disease, the last one. And it's the COMPASS study. We already have preliminary data we'll present in a moment. The study is entitled Rivaroxaban plus aspirin versus aspirin in patients with prior percutaneous coronary intervention. So the COMPASS trial recently demonstrated that the dual pathway inhibition with rivaroxaban 2.5 milligrams twice daily plus aspirin 100 milligrams daily versus 100 milligrams daily of aspirin, the combination of both was significantly of benefit in patients with chronic coronary syndromes or peripheral arterial disease. We know this data, and actually it was very, very interesting data. So here we are now. What about stenting the patient versus not stenting? It's a different situation. It's a subgroup of the previous patients presented. Here we are. We have 16,000 patients with chronic coronary artery disease. Prior PCI, 60% of the patients. No prior PCI, 40% of the patients. And both groups were randomized into the dual rivaroxaban plus aspirin versus aspirin alone. The follow-up was actually 3 years. It's interesting the timing of the prior PCI. It will not make any difference in the final results, but it is interesting. MI 5% occurred within the last year, 20% within 2 years, and then in 62% within 3 years. It will not make a difference. The PCI was actually single vessel disease in 60% versus multi-vessel disease in 39%. So the primary efficacy endpoint was cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, or a stroke. And the figures are in favor, certainly, of the combination with a hazard ratio of 0.74. We are talking about a 3-year follow-up of figures between 6 and 8% cardiovascular events in the prior PCI group, and also the same in no PCI. It didn't make any difference. Secondary efficacy endpoint, all-cause death, also in favor of the combination of the two drugs with rivaroxaban. Interesting, 2.5 milligrams only, twice daily, plus aspirin. And in terms of the measure bleeding, you know, it's a problem though. It's 2 to 4%, a little bit more in the group treated with the combination of drugs, rivaroxaban plus aspirin. But if we look at the events that we are preventing, ischemic events, which is 6-8%, here is 2 to 4%, so still you win overall. But I think it's a word of caution when we use these drugs. So I guess what I can say that in terms of the conclusions of this paper, it's not been published yet. In patients with prior PCI, consistent reductions in the primary composite of cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, or a stroke were demonstrated irrespective of the timing of prior PCI as far back as 10 years. And second, there were more measured bleeding events in the dual group, but there was no significant increase in fatal bleeding, critical organ bleeding, or intracranial hemorrhage. I must say, I have begun to use this combination of 2.5 twice a day of rivaroxaban plus aspirin in people at a high risk, but I'd like to know your opinion because you're always worried about the bleeding. What do you think, Bonnie?
Yeah, no, I think very interesting study. I think what we need, I think, are better risk prediction algorithms in order to identify who is at the greatest risk of bleeding and to be able to balance that risk-benefit ratio.
David?
Yeah, I'm impressed by the results. I agree that ischemic events are much more important than bleeding. But in general, patients don't. I don't see this moving the needle at all. I don't think this is going to change practice.
You're right. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I come from the surgical background and the TAVI, the TAVR background, and we tend to really be very, very pro dual antiplatelet therapy. And I've always had forever, always been having to call my cardiology colleagues and say, by the way, I think you should continue DAP. No, I think it's time to stop it. So I think I don't think it's going to change much either. I agree with you, although I personally believe that from the interventional and surgical and TAVR side of things, the ischemic events are much worse, and we would tend to be more pro going with dual antiplatelet therapy, no matter what it is. This is just one of the ways.
The problem also is what you mentioned.
But I agree with you. I agree with her. We need we need to up our game regarding risk assessment for bleeding.
And longer follow-up too,
Yeah.
because these studies are all 3-4 years.
That would
but-
actually solve the problem, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Anyways, an interesting approach, Chris.
Yeah, so I guess that one of the things you brought up, though, is that so we don't use rivaroxaban with dual antiplatelet, and this is with aspirin, but we just finished saying that maybe we should just be using ticagrelor or something else. So it's a little bit, as the paradigm shifts, it's clearly superior to aspirin with it, but the question ends up, how does it fit in with ticagrelor or better antiplatelet therapies? So some unanswered questions, but I would agree with you. The whole the issue of better predicting who's going to have a bleed. Now, some of the people who are high risk for events, it's also the same factors that look like high risk for bleeding, but it would be nice if we could do a better way of differentiating that.
It's going to be difficult.
I think so.
Unless there is a clear history of bleeding, all these scores, at least in my experience, is very difficult to predict. And even, I don't think we do them, frankly. It's the reality.
Yeah.
Anyway, but it's another pharmacological approach. But finally, let's get into the surgeons. Now, you will see. First of all, we have a study here about early surgery of conservative care for asymptomatic aortic stenosis, a paper from Seoul in South Korea, which gives you a lot to think about it. It seems to me we all were brought up with the concept that you can have severe aortic stenosis, but if it is asymptomatic, you may accept 1% mortality per year. This is basically, and still the guidelines are in that mode. Well, when you read to this paper, it really shakes you up because things may be not as simple as we have said. So let me now go into some of the details. This was a multi-center trial. The number of patients was not large, actually. It was 145 asymptomatic patients with very severe aortic stenosis, defined as valve area less than 0.75, aortic jet velocity more than 4.5, and a mean transaortic gradient of more than 50 millimeters of mercury. Either of the three puts you already into the severe aortic stenosis. The primary endpoint was composite of death during or within 30 days after surgery, death from cardiovascular causes in the follow-up, or death from other causes. The follow-up was 6.8 years. So the question of this paper is the following. I will tell you the results. The early surgical group actually had a primary endpoint of 1% mortality overall, where the group that was left without intervention, without surgery, was 15% over the follow-up that I am mentioning. It's a lot. Well, 6 years, it doubles our concept of 1% per year. But the results were very striking. And then they went into other pieces of information, and in fact, cardiac death, non-cardiac death, all were very significant that we should operate earlier. This is basically what the paper comes from. So here's the conclusion. among asymptomatic patients with very severe aortic stenosis, the incidence of the composite of operative mortality or death from cardiovascular causes during the follow-up period was significantly lower among those who underwent early aortic valve replacement than among those who received conservative care. This is actually the message of this study. This is called the recovery study. And I think the message is very important, but I'd like to know your opinion, Joe, about maybe we are waiting too long, really.
Well, I mean, I think, just with all due respect to the cardiology colleagues and others, I think we passed this one a long time ago, frankly. I think the Partner 1 and Partner 2 trials, especially Partner 1, showed this dramatically. I mean, we were talking about a 3 to 4 month 10 to 12% mortality rate just waiting around. In those days, we actually had a 10% mortality rate during the workup. So the combination of being 82 plus having severe aortic stenosis, defined just by the numbers, not by any symptoms, was lethal. So I think the key word here in this study is very. These are actually very significant stenosis. This is very significant aortic stenosis. This is not just, partial, some sort of kind of on the borderline stenosis. So these three parameters for aortic stenosis, in most of our opinions, should be operated on, and whether it's a TAVR or whether it's an open surgery. So I just think this kind of nails the coffin shut, that it corroborates some data that's been out there for a while. And my guess is if you had a good stress test, all these patients, every one of them almost would be symptomatic.
I agree with you. Stress testing is quite helpful. You realize that the symptomatic patients are not.
Exactly. I think we're not so great at assessing symptoms
I
in
think
terms
that's
of
what we
history
should
and
do.
physical.
Anyway, this paper is good because now it's stubborn, let's say, but this applies.
Yeah, and I think this will inform the guidelines. The next set of guidelines is going to be a little bit more aggressive, I think.
Well, thank you.
And the other thing about this, real quick, is that the surgical mortality was incredibly low. So, last decade, the interventional aortic valve treatment has just gotten a lot better.
Well, thank you. Let's go into the aortic valve, and this is the registry, the French TAVI registry, which is very interesting. Dr. Eric Van Velde from Leiden University presented this paper, and basically is a very well done study in which they look at the actually difference between balloon expandable versus self-expandable approach to see in a follow-up, short and longer follow-up, what the results were. And actually what we are really talking about is a large study. I don't know how many patients were actually involved. 12,000 patients. Okay, these 12,000 patients in this registry between 2013 and 2015. So this is very recent. So we cannot say these are all materials. But anyway, 12,000 patients, 8,000 had balloon expandable, and about 4,000 had actually self-expanding. The first one is the Edwards, and the second is the Medtronic. What they did is very clever. They matched both groups, each group with 4,000 patients, and they look at 25 variables to do a perfect matching. It's never perfect, but anyway. And then they follow them for a period of about 2 years. And the results were actually quite striking, in favor of the balloon expandable approach. And we are not talking even about pacemakers here. Here what we are talking is about mortality. Well, this is the data. They say in match propensity analysis, the incidence of the first co-primary outcome was higher with the expanding approach, the self-expanding approach, 19.8% versus 11.9%. This is actually very, very significant in this particular grade. But then they look at each component that they look at, hospital mortality, all-cause mortality, and the results are equally significant. So the question is this is a follow-up of about 2 to 3 years, and the question is this real? Because the results are quite impressive. And I just want to say, Now we use these types of valves have advanced more recently into new devices, but what is important of the study that I didn't mention is one of the variables they look was aortic regurgitation.
Right.
And actually they tried to equate the mortality with the aortic regurgitation. It's not clear that you can put both together, but they look at both variables, and in both variables, the balloon expandable didn't do so well as the others. So I'd like to have your opinion.
Yeah, the first thing is that 13 to 15 is an important time period, but there are newer devices now on the shelf, and for the self-expanding devices, they are better than they were. The original self-expanding device did have some significant issues with both pacemakers and paravalvular leaks. It is also, so I would tend to believe these results. They're a little bit old in the sense that both of the devices have gotten better. I think that it's an interesting study because it's very rare to be able to do a study like this. For example, at the ACC STS level, through the TVT database, this study might not be able to be done just from contractual purposes. So I'm glad that the French registry did it. So that's kind of how I look at it. It's believable. I think another interesting point, just to throw it out there, this is kind of a little controversial, is that Edwards just kind of boxed their self-expanding platform that they've been working on for 2 or 3 years, or even longer. So it's interesting that one of the major manufacturers has decided not to go into a self-expanding platform. I think the data is real, especially from that era. I think the results, the designs have changed, and maybe even more so on the self-expanding side. But generally, some of those concerns are still apropos.
There's less aortic incompetence today with the new
Yes.
self-expanding.
There's two things that have happened. There's a little bit more pacemaker in the self-expanding than there used to be.
Yeah.
And there's a little less AI
Yeah.
in the self-expanding than there
Which
used
may
to be.
decrease mortality.
Right.
So, any comments, Bonnie?
No, I think it has a lot probably to do with the AR, right? The AR, to try to decrease the AR as much as possible here.
Should be a randomized study, though, because, for example, a number of variables will not look at, and that is the aortic root calcification, the size of the femoral. So what I'm saying is they did 25 variables they look at, but there are many others that may play a role, maybe.
And they did a good propensity analysis, but
Yeah.
it's not perfect propensity analysis.
Do you think there will be a randomized study down the line? in
No.
this? No. Yeah.
I don't see it.
It's changed too
I think the best thing we can
Would be
do is to
difficult.
take a data set of, say, 25,000 patients.
It should be, but David, any comments?
No, I was doubt. I mean, even the editorial called for a randomized trial. I can't imagine that would happen.
The only way it could happen would be through the NIH or something, some
Yeah.
really neutral agency.
It will be difficult. Yeah. Any comment, Chris? Good. All right. So let's now, aortic valve replacement. Now, after the replacement, the question is to give rivaroxaban. Where this all came from? Well, first of all, there are 2 papers presented here, the Galileo papers, which is rivaroxaban after transcatheter aortic valve replacement. The first one with George Dangas from our institution. And then we'll talk about the second one in a moment. There is some data in the literature, as you know, with imaging, that once these bioprosthetic materials, after TAVR, you follow them with CT, there is some sclerotic processes going on with the leaflets, and then they do not close so well, or they do not open so well. And it was suggested that thrombus material is part of all of these. This was suggested some time ago. Well, these are the basis of the study. First, I will say from the beginning that they presented a study in this meeting of Galileo in which they look at the use of rivaroxaban in patients following TAVR in terms of what happened with the leaflets. And certainly they show some benefit by giving rivaroxaban on that aspect. But what I'm presenting now is completely the opposite from the clinical point of view. So no relationship between what you see by imaging and giving the drugs versus what you see clinically. Basically, what we are talking about here is a randomization of more than 1,500 patients that had successful TAVR and then underwent rivaroxaban at a dose of 10 milligrams daily with aspirin at a dose of 75 to 100 milligrams daily versus aspirin at a dose of 75 milligrams or 200 milligrams daily. So the question is, what happened with the group with the rivaroxaban? I want to make the long story short and just to say that the monitoring board, the safety monitoring board, because safety concerns, stopped the study. So basically, we have an efficacy outcome, which was the composite of death or thromboembolic events, and then we have a primary safety outcome, which is a MESHA disabling or life-threatening bleeding. After a median of 17 months, the primary efficacy outcome, 9.8% to the rivaroxaban group versus 7.2% on the aspirin antiplatelet group. And the safety was also bad for the rivaroxaban group. So we really have big trouble. And here is a clear example that whatever we might see by imaging or pathologically, not necessarily is what we are going to see clinically. Maybe the dose of rivaroxaban given 10 milligrams was too low, but if you give higher, will be more bleeding. So what is the answer?
Didn't work.
C'est fini.
Yeah, I don't know. It's disappointing, but it's we haven't seen that work, right?
Right.
I mean,
Why did it make things worse, though?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I have my doubts about antiplatelet therapy in general in this area. The fact of the matter is that when we see it, and then you use more aggressive, Coumadinization or something of that nature, then it goes away. So it doesn't go away unless you do that. It doesn't go away with dual antiplatelet therapy or anything like that. So it is a big problem, though. It needs to be answered because right now we're having about 12 to 14%, leaflet thrombosis rate in TAVR, and it's about 3 or 4% in surgical aortic valves. So it's an issue.
And the problem is clinically, as we always know from all the years with using warfarin, it takes a while to get your INR out.
Yeah.
So it would have been much more convenient to have used something that's rapid with it, but just
But you're right, it didn't work.
It didn't work.
But that doesn't mean we need to keep on. We have to keep on trying here because it's actually a really important problem. The other thing about the bleeding events is that the average age of these patients is in the 81, 82, 83.
that's right.
So that's a whole other a layer.
Well, it's a problem, as you mentioned, because the antiplatelet group, for example, was actually clopidogrel was with aspirin, and the incidence rate of events was actually 7.2 per 100. So it's an issue. Today we use platelet drugs, antiplatelet drugs for these patients, but certainly rivaroxaban is out of business here. But we have a problem still with TAVR, okay? Any comment, David?
Nothing else, no.
Bonnie?
Oh, no other comments. I think except the subclinical imaging, I think that how that was did show an effect that we have to be cautious about acting on subclinical surrogate measures. Really, we need the clinical outcomes to drive practice.
Thank you. So we have now heart failure, and we have a couple of studies which are actually quite interesting, and I will summarize them. One is the issue of sacubitril valsartan across the spectrum of ejection fraction. This study is an international study that was presented, the Paragon HF study by Scott Solomon from the Brigham. And it is interesting, what we have with this approach of Varney is that if you look at intermediate ejection fractions, or the mid-range that we call 45 to 50%, it appears it didn't work. Where if you look at ejection fractions between 45% below, it works. So what they decided to do is to actually join both the studies, the first one, the Paradigm HF and the Paragon HF trials, to see what the results would be when you put all this data together. It's one of these things that was done after the study both the studies were finished. And just to make the long story short, the findings are that as the ejection fraction is lower, the combination of these two agents is better than the ACE inhibition, okay? But as the ejection fraction goes towards normal, you lose this power, but this is still powerful between 45 and 55%. So the basic principle that, at least what they try to convey, is if we have an ejection fraction that is between 45 and 55%, we should not give up the possibility of using ARNI. This is basically the concept. What do you think?
Well, I'd like to think it works for it. You know, I think that when you mix two studies together, sometimes
Yeah.
statistically, it's not the same weight of evidence for it.
I was telling a colleague of mine this afternoon about this, you know. I try to look at the statistics and it's a nightmare. You know, I think the only question that I would like to say, David, you might be in agreement, we have to think about this. What happens with the patients who do not have a normal ejection fraction, but they are intermediate? Probably we don't have the answer yet, except many of the studies that show some answers, like anti-aldosterone approaches, is ad hoc. All has been found afterwards, not during the prospective side. This is bothersome.
And I think you add the other idea of desperation about how to take care of those patients. We don't really have any idea what else to do. So I think that drives some of this hysteria too.
And then how you measure ejection fraction is also
Yes,
another issue.
it's
because-
such a variable measure. This is just a single measure, right? But we know that EF can vary a great
Yeah.
deal.
Well, so this is for this type of drugs, ARNI, but the other ones that are interesting as the SGLT2 inhibitors. I don't know, they are really climbing the ladder so fast that my question to you is who's going to be the winner here? Maybe these are the drugs they are beginning to do not so bad compared with ARNI when you compare all the studies. Well, anyway, the study presented here in this meeting was the DAPA-HF study and was entitled Effects of Dapagliflozin on Symptoms, Function and Quality of Life in Patients with Heart Failure and Reduced Ejection Fraction. Well, basically, 50% of these patients with heart failure and reduced ejection fraction were diabetics, and 50% were not. Because of the time, I just have to summarize the data, but I will say the following. Very interestingly, at 4 months of follow-up, when you use the appropriate approach to quality of life, and then you follow them for 8 months, improve in the group giving these particular agents compared with the group being placebo. I think this is fascinating because in a way you improve symptomatology, but it's progressive improvement, not in all patients, but in a significant number of patients. And they use the KCCQ test, you know, in terms of functional capacity and so forth. And then in terms of the outcomes, we already know the outcomes with diabetes or without diabetes, just published in the New England Journal of Medicine, are quite striking. So, Chris, are you excited?
Yeah, the more I'm seeing of this class, as you said, the more excited it is because we went initially from diabetics, but I think in terms of the cardiology community, this is a game changer because now it's non-diabetics, that you're making an impact in heart failure. So it really becomes a cardiovascular drug. You can't just delegate it all to the diabetologist or the people in that area. And I'm hopeful that that with HFrEF and the right study, that maybe we'll see something in this group that's been so hard to treat. I mean, I'm looking forward to the other data, but it's really tremendously exciting. Still need to understand better why does it work.
Yeah, that's a different issue. But anyway, Joe, are you left out with so much pharmacology? What do you think?
Yeah, I am a little bit, but that's okay. We're, you know, the
You are
only thing
not anxious about it.
Yeah, I'm not. No, I'm not anxious about any of this. In fact, for the heart failure patients, I think it's great. I hope there's pharmacology because surgery doesn't work very well. But I would hope that they start figuring out regarding some of these drugs and heart failure is to segment them out into different kinds of heart failure, a little bit more, in a little bit more robust and sophisticated way. That's just my own personal plea.
Bonnie?
Yeah, no, I think it's a total game changer for cardiology and one of the most
Incredible, isn't it?
exciting, yeah, and let's hope it works in HFpEF. because that would really, be the winner.
Very
And
soon we'll get
yeah.
you out of business. Will be the atrial fibrillation will not exist with this drug.
That'd be
Maybe.
wonderful. I'd find something else to do with my time. But the joke comes around, how many specific classes of medicine are people with advanced heart failure going to need? So now it's out to 4.
So the next thing
At
is what
least.
about
Cardio-onc.
cardio-oncology?
Yes,
You
I
know,
think
if
of
someone
prevention.
you start to think they're at risk,
Yes.
do you?
I think a prevention trial needs to be done.
Well, it's very fascinating. We have these two papers in heart failure with two competing new groups of drugs, which is fascinating, and so forth. I'd like to finish with 2 papers on prevention, which I think is an issue that we really have to pay attention. And one is the Orion 10 and the Orion 9 studies. Well, we have an interesting drug, inclisiran, which is for patients, at least at this time, at high risk, at least to be considered. This is a drug that is basically is an antisense drug interfering with RNA and inhibiting what is fascinating is the production of PCSK9. That's the key. And this drug, interestingly, you can give it twice a year, and the cholesterol levels, LDL levels, drop to 50% persistently. So it's one of these miracles also that you see from time to time, isn't it? Well, the paper that is presented today, which is actually Orion 10, it looks at the efficacy and safety of inclisiran 300 milligrams compared with placebo in a high-risk population of patients with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. There were actually 1,500 patients with 4 injections of this material over an 18-month period. All the patients had been on statins, but the level of LDL was higher than 70 milligrams DL. And all had atherosclerotic disease, and the average age of these patients were actually 66 years. So just to make about effectiveness, it dropped the LDL cholesterol by 50%. And in terms of side effects, very similar to the placebo, except on the injection side, which was actually 2.6%. In terms of cardiovascular events, the study was too short, not enough number of patients, and I don't think we are at the time to really discuss this. And then the Orion 9, very similar information. These patients were heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, almost the same results. 30% of these patients had atherosclerotic disease. The rest just had the genetic indication that they had familial hypercholesterolemia. But the results were exactly the same, 50% decrease in LDL cholesterol. And the side effects at the site of the injection were a little bit higher. This is fascinating. What do you think?
It's absolutely fascinating, and it's, we are in a biotech world, precision medicine, genetics identifies a target. We first had the monoclonals, we have the antisense, and now we have the small interfering RNAs. And the whole mechanism is by genetic discovery of what happens in the cell, but with this risk complex, you get a pharmacodynamic effect that goes for 6 months. In fact, there's an effect out to 1 year. So if the safety issue ends up being safe and there's an outcomes trial that's been enrolling, so there's more data, it could be a paradigm shift where you could have a prevention visit and you see somebody every 6 months, they get an injection, you knock down their LDL, you check their blood pressure, their diabetes, you work on diet and exercise. And does that have to be in a doctor's office, or could that be could it be?
It solves the issue of adherence here.
It does. And
It
could it be
solves
over?
a huge problem.
You could be maybe at CVS or Walmart or someplace else, and they just get the nurse talks to them about this.
It's amazing. Bonnie?
Really exciting, I think, in terms of LDL reduction, and really clever, smart design of the drug. I mean, it's amazing.
I think looked at in a more global sense, our molecular understanding of disease in general, not just in this specific sense, it's really exciting for the future. Maybe we could really move medicine this way.
Any comments?
No comments. The result is incredible, though.
Molecular surgery.
Okay. Thank you. I was going to present the last paper. Actually, was my presentation on a trial in an underserved population in Harlem, which was quite fascinating. And just to summarize, even in a socioeconomic environment like that, we were able to show how if there is adherence to what you do, particularly in communities like that, that they feel that they mean something to people, the results are fascinating, very positive. So the message that I would like to give is the concept that if you go to an underserved population, you try to do something, it's not going to work, is completely false. We have a lot of experience, and we did 600 families, children and adults in Harlem with very specific approaches, and it just works. But since I am the chairman, I'm going to say not to my study, so I can decide.
Do you know what you've done with the family approach? Because everyone talks about, well, what's the point of polygenic risk scores and everything else? And I say, well, if you look at the work that Dr. Fuster and his colleagues have done, targeting the parents and the children, that's the hope. It's targeting families. And I think if we could start earlier, and you've done it in different types of environments, it's possible to do this. The hope is there, and you've shown that you can. I think to your great credit.
We are working now with 50,000 children and families in different parts of I can tell you, I think earlier you get, and if you get involved, the family is a big plus. There's no question about it. Well, look, I really appreciate your presence here today. I think we discussed the best we could over a period of 1 hour, all these studies, but certainly it has been an interesting meeting, isn't it? Particularly from the pharmacological point of view, it seems we are moving 1 inch at a time, and very nicely on a number of new drugs, and very, very exciting. Well, thank you very much. I hope we will get together again for another session, and I will invite you from Philadelphia, at least the 3 of you in another city of the world.
Wonderful.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Love to be there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much
Or
for
in New
your
York.
attention. Thank you. Thank you very much.